the Jornada del Muerto Desert, the place of the dead man's journey. In the gray pre-dawn sky above New Mexico, no human being had ever seen what happened in that instant. A flash, brighter than the sun, 100 times brighter. A mushroom of smoke and fire rose 18 kilometers into the sky. The ground trembled underfoot. Windows shattered 100 kilometers away. Robert Oppenheimer, physicist, director of the Manhattan Project, the man who had just altered the course of human civilization, stood and watched the fireball. And in that moment, he was not thinking about physics. He was not thinking about equations. He quoted an ancient Sanskrit text, a text written at least 3,000 years before that morning. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." That line comes from the Bhagavad Gita, part of the Mahabharata, one of the oldest epics in human history. Most people took it as a poetic gesture, a beautiful flourish from an educated man at a moment of extreme tension. But what if Oppenheimer knew something the others did not? What if he, a physicist who read Sanskrit in the original, who had personally studied the Vedas, understood that this quotation was not a metaphor? What if he was simply rereading a criminal report? Today we will tell you about a hypothesis that has existed for decades on the fringes of official science. A hypothesis supported by artifacts from 5 continents, texts from a dozen ancient cultures, and geological anomalies for which modern science still has no convincing explanation. The hypothesis that nuclear weapons were not invented in 1945, and that humanity has already once lived through, or failed to survive, its own nuclear age. Let us begin with what is known for certain, with facts no scholar disputes. Robert Oppenheimer read Sanskrit fluently. He had learned it specifically to read the Vedas and the Mahabharata in their original language. He considered these texts among the deepest intellectual achievements of humanity. The Mahabharata, an epic of roughly 100,000 couplets, composed between approximately 400 BCE and 400 CE, but rooted in oral traditions reaching back to the 2nd millennium BCE, is not simply a collection of tales about gods and heroes. It is a document full of precise technical descriptions. In the Adiparva, the first book of the Mahabharata, a weapon called the Brahmastra is described. Here is what is written there, as literally as translation allows. A projectile that never missed its mark, invisible, yet capable of killing, an explosion of such power that the earth shook, a cloud of smoke and flame, like a pillar of fire, brighter than 1,000 suns. After the blast, the sky turned red. The water in the rivers boiled. Notice the details. Not merely a powerful weapon. Specific physical effects. Thermal radiation intense enough to boil water. A shockwave that shakes the earth. Smoke rising after detonation. But that is not the most remarkable part. In the Dronaparva, the 7th book, the aftermath of the Brahmastra's use is described. And here is where a modern nuclear physicist feels a cold certainty settle in the chest. After the explosion, the survivors' hair fell out. Their fingernails turned black and dropped away. Food became poisonous. People aged within days. Infants were born dead or deformed. This is a clinical description of acute radiation sickness, symptom by symptom, in the same order medical textbooks use today. Hair loss, nail destruction, immune system collapse, contamination of food supplies by radionuclides, genetic mutations. The author of the Mahabharata had no way of knowing about radiation sickness from theoretical reasoning. The atomic structure of matter became known to science only at the beginning of the 20th century. Radioactive decay was discovered in 1896. The mechanism of radiation damage even later. Where did the author know this from? There are only two possible answers. Either this is an extraordinary coincidence, or someone witnessed these effects firsthand and wrote them down. Oppenheimer knew both answers, and, judging by everything, he had made his choice. In 1965, in a television interview, when asked whether the test bomb in New Mexico had been the first nuclear weapon in history, he replied quietly and with great care, "The first in modern history." The first in modern history. He chose those words very deliberately. In 1922, British archaeologist John Marshall began excavations in the Pakistani province of Sindh. He was looking for the remains of an ancient settlement. Instead, he found a city built with such precision that modern architects have stood before its ruins in silent admiration. A sewage system more sophisticated than anything medieval Europe would achieve 3,000 years later. Two-story brick houses fired at a uniform temperature, straight streets oriented by the cardinal points, an original script we have still not deciphered. Mohenjo-Daro, the Mound of the Dead, was the largest city of the Indus Valley civilization, home to between 30,000 and 50,000 people at its height. It flourished for nearly 1,000 years and vanished around 1900 BCE. Official science has offered various explanations: drought, a shift in the course of the Indus River, the Aryan invasion. Each theory has serious problems with its evidence, but there are several facts that none of them explains at all. In 1927, during excavations of the city's central quarter, archaeologists found skeletons, or rather, what remained of them. Dozens of people who had died directly on the streets of the city. In some areas, their bones lay in the open air with no sign of burial. That alone is strange. But strangest of all is this. In the 1970s, a group of researchers, whose findings were published in the Journal of Archaeological Science, conducted a radiation analysis of these bones. The radioactivity levels of some samples exceeded normal background radiation by 50 times. 50 times. In a city with no volcano, no uranium deposit, and no geological explanation for such radiation levels. In several areas of Mohenjo-Daro and the surrounding districts, researchers found fragments of something extraordinary. The surface of sand and clay had been melted and had solidified into a uniform glassy mass. Similar to what forms in a nuclear detonation, the temperature required to produce such melting is approximately 1,500 degrees Celsius. No ancient kiln, no known meteorite impact, no volcanic process explains these traces at this geographical location. And if the map of destruction at Mohenjo-Daro is laid over a standard blast wave model of an explosion, the pattern is startlingly familiar. The heaviest destruction at the center, diminishing outward to the periphery. This radial character of ruin precisely reproduces what modern nuclear engineers call the zone of total destruction. Sir Mortimer Wheeler, one of the leading British archaeologists who excavated Mohenjo-Daro in the 1940s, wrote in his private notes not intended for publication, which became known only after his death. I have no rational explanation for the pattern of destruction in the central sector. The only analogy that comes to mind, though one I dare not state aloud, is the photographs of Hiroshima. Wheeler wrote that in 1948, 3 years after Hiroshima, and he did not dare state it aloud, what happened at Mohenjo-Daro around 1900 BCE. Official science still has no answer that explains all the anomalies simultaneously. But there is one text that may offer one, written in Sanskrit. It describes a weapon after whose use the city was turned to ash and its inhabitants burned like dry grass in the wind. That text is the Ramayana, and it describes precisely that geographical region. Over a century has passed, and there is still no consensus. At 7:17 in the morning of June 30th, 1908, something exploded above central Siberia. The explosion was powerful enough to flatten trees across 2,000 square kilometers. Seismographs recorded the shock in Great Britain, Germany, and Java. The pressure wave circled the Earth twice. The nights in London were bright enough to read a newspaper by for several weeks afterward. Modern physicists estimate the yield at between 10 and 15 megatons in TNT equivalent. That is roughly 2,000 bombs of the Hiroshima scale, or a mid-range thermonuclear warhead from a modern nuclear arsenal. But here is what is strangest. There is no epicenter, no crater, no meteorite fragments, no material trace of whatever fell. The forest was leveled, but the ground beneath it is intact. Trees at the very heart of the devastation stand vertical, stripped of branches and bark, but vertical. This means the shockwave moved downward from above, not outward from a point of impact. Classic behavior of an airburst, that is, a detonation that occurred in the atmosphere at an altitude of 5 to 10 kilometers. Exactly the altitude at which nuclear warheads are detonated for maximum blast wave efficiency. Over more than 100 years, scientists have proposed dozens of hypotheses. A meteor that disintegrated in the atmosphere, a comet, antimatter, a mini black hole, a natural gas explosion. None of them accounts for all the details. A meteor or comet would have left chemical traces. None were found. Antimatter or a black hole would produce physical effects incompatible with what was observed. Natural gas cannot yield that magnitude of blast or propagate a pressure wave across the entire planet. In the 1990s, a team of American physicists from the University of Texas carried out a detailed computer analysis of the Tunguska event, comparing its parameters with every known type of explosion. The conclusion of their study, published in Nature, was carefully worded but eloquent. The parameters of the event correspond most precisely to the model of a nuclear detonation in the atmosphere. But whose nuclear detonation? In 1908, when Rutherford had only just begun his experiments with the atomic nucleus? There is one further detail that is rarely mentioned. In 1908, shortly before the Tunguska explosion, one of the greatest geniuses in human history, Nikola Tesla, was conducting experiments at his laboratory on Long Island with the wireless transmission of energy across great distances. He dreamed of sending electrical power across the entire globe. A few weeks before the explosion, Tesla publicly announced that he intended to conduct a demonstration of wireless transmission over long range. After the Tunguska event, he never again spoke of that project, and shortly afterward closed his laboratory. A coincidence? Perhaps. But Tesla left behind thousands of pages of notes. Most of them were confiscated by American intelligence services immediately after his death in 1943. And they remain classified to this day. A nuclear explosion in 1908. No crater, no fragments, no official answer. In its place, the confiscated notebooks of a genius who kept his silence for the rest of his life. In 1996, Egyptian geochemist Ahmad Kagaz made a discovery that overturned his understanding of ancient Egyptian culture. Studying artifacts from the tomb of Tutankhamun, the young pharaoh who ruled approximately from 1332 to 1323 BCE, he noticed something unusual in one of the pectoral amulets. At the center of the amulet, surrounded by gold, lapis lazuli, and carnelian, glowed a yellow-green stone. Not a ruby, not an emerald, not any of the known Egyptian gemstones. Analysis showed it was glass, but glass of an extraordinary kind. Libyan desert glass. Physically, it is identical to tektites, glassy formations produced by the ultra-high temperature melting of sand. The temperature required for such melting exceeds 1,700 degrees Celsius. For comparison, the magma of volcanic lava ranges from 700 to 1,200 degrees. Even the most powerful volcanoes do not achieve that temperature. The field of Libyan glass extends across approximately 29 million tons in the Great Desert of Egypt and Libya. Official geology dates it to roughly 26 million years ago and attributes it to the impact of a large meteorite. But there is a problem. There is no crater. Not a large one, not a small one. The chemical composition of the glass does not match any known meteorite material, and the shape of the field corresponds to no known model of a meteorite impact. But let us set the geology aside for a moment and ask a different question. Tutankhamun ruled more than 3,000 years before the Common Era. The field of Libyan glass lies in the Great Desert, hundreds of kilometers from the Nile, from any trade route, from any Egyptian settlement. How did the Egyptians know about this glass? How did they get there, into one of the most hostile places on Earth? Why did they consider this glass valuable enough to place at the center of an amulet for a young pharaoh, alongside gold and precious stones? Egyptian priests held a tradition of preserving knowledge about celestial signs. Meteorites in ancient Egypt were called iron of heaven, material fallen from the realm of the gods. If the Libyan glass was formed not by a meteorite, but by something else, something that occurred far more recently than 26 million years ago, then who might have witnessed that something? And what did they know about it? In 2013, a team of geologists from the University of Johannesburg conducted new thermoluminescence dating of Libyan glass samples. The results were contradictory. Some samples gave an age of 26 million years, but others were far younger. Some samples returned an age of only 10,000 to 12,000 years. 10,000 years ago, at the close of the last ice age, when, according to many ancient traditions, the gods were at war with one another in the heavens. Tutankhamun carried on his chest glass, whose formation temperature exceeds the capacity of any natural process known to science. He or his priests knew where to find it, in one of the most inaccessible places on Earth, and they considered that knowledge important enough to take it to the grave. What did he know? What did his priests know? What did they see on the horizon in the direction of the Great Desert? And what did they leave for those who came after in the form of a piece of melted sand set in gold? In the 6th century BCE, when the Greeks were only beginning to reason about the nature of matter, when Pythagoras was formulating his theorem and Confucius was writing about morality, in India there lived a sage named Kanada. His real name was Kashyapa, but he acquired the epithet Kanada, the grain eater. According to tradition, he was so absorbed in contemplating the nature of things that he would walk through fields collecting the tiniest grains, meditating on how matter was constructed. Kanada wrote a text called the Vaisheshika Sutra, and this text is one of the most astonishing documents in the intellectual history of our species. Kanada formulated an atomic theory, not in vague metaphors but as clear physical principles. The smallest indivisible particle of matter, the Anu, is eternal and indestructible. 2 Anu joined together form a Dvyanuka. 3 joined together form a Trianuka, the smallest particle of matter visible to the eye. Atom, molecule, and the assertion that visible matter is composed of microscopic invisible particles. Democritus, to whom Western tradition usually attributes the discovery of atomic theory, lived at roughly the same time. Scholars still debate whether their work was independent, but Canada went further than Democritus, much further. In the texts of Canada and his followers, one encounters descriptions of how the Anu can be divided with the release of heat and light, descriptions of how certain combinations of Anu form unstable compounds, descriptions of a chain reaction in which the division of one Anu triggers the division of its neighbors. Coincidence? Perhaps. But look more broadly. In the Arthashastra, a treatise on statecraft composed around 300 BCE, there is an entire chapter on the weapons of the gods, including detailed instructions for storing, transporting, and deploying substances that burn in water and consume without fire. In the Yajurveda, one of the 4 sacred Vedas, there is a hymn describing fire that does not burn and heat that kills without touch, passing through the covering of skin, through bone, to the very blood. Gamma radiation. That is precisely how modern radiological safety manuals describe gamma radiation. And parallel to Canada, at roughly the same time, there lived another Indian sage, Sushruta. He wrote the Sushruta Samhita, a medical treatise considered one of the founding texts of Ayurveda. In one chapter of the Sushruta Samhita, diseases are described that pass from parents to children through an invisible inheritance in the blood. Diseases in which the blood becomes sick, and this sick blood turns healthy descendants into the ill. Hereditary disease, genetic inheritance, DNA mutation. In the 2nd century BCE. Where did they know this from? It could not have been derived theoretically from clinical observation of that era. It requires microscopes, chemical analysis, genetics. Or it requires being a witness to mass genetic mutations, the kind that arise after nuclear irradiation, and observing them across several generations. Ancient India described the atomic structure of matter, chain nuclear reactions, and the genetic consequences of radiation exposure millennia before European science had even posed those questions. This is either the greatest coincidence in the intellectual history of our species, or it is the legacy of knowledge acquired through direct experience. Experience we would call a nuclear catastrophe. For millennia, Sodom and Gomorrah were considered either a religious parable or entirely invented cities. Then, in 2008, American archaeologist Stephen Collins, representing the organization Tall El Hammam Excavation Project, began excavations at a site called Tall El Hammam in the northeastern part of the Jordan Valley. What he found forced a reconsideration not merely of the biblical text, but of the physics of the ancient world. Tall El Hammam is a large, ancient Bronze Age city. It flourished from approximately 3,500 to 1,700 BCE, nearly 2,000 years. Then it vanished, entirely, within a single generation. But the character of the destruction corresponded to no known pattern. Not fire, not earthquake, not conquest. Something fundamentally different. Collins's research team found, in the layers dating to approximately 1,700 BCE, the following: material permeating the entire excavated field, including the walls of buildings and fragments of pottery, contained uniformly distributed droplets of melted metal, bronze, copper, silver. The melting point of bronze is 950 degrees. Of silver, 961 degrees. Molten silver and bronze distributed uniformly across the entire destruction layer. An ordinary fire, even a very intense one, produces uneven distribution. Here it is uniform, across the entire city, simultaneously. But there was more. The team found pottery fragments with a specific surface treatment. The outer faces of ceramic sherds were melted and had solidified into a glassy state. The temperature required to melt ceramic in this way exceeds 1,500 degrees Celsius. A pottery kiln of that era produced 900 degrees at most. Finally, and this is the most arresting detail, the researchers found a layer of shocked quartz, a mineral formation that arises exclusively under pressures exceeding 5 to 10 gigapascals. Such pressure occurs under two sets of circumstances: the impact of a large meteorite or a nuclear explosion. There is no meteorite crater anywhere in this region. Now let us look at the text of Genesis, chapter 19. Lot and his family flee from Sodom. They are commanded not to look back. Lot's wife looks back and becomes a pillar of salt. That detail has always been read as metaphor or as miraculous transformation. But what if it is a literal description? A person caught in the path of intense thermal radiation and blast overpressure undergoes thermal carbonization, a literal charring of the body. Salt is a white, crystalline substance. A carbonized human figure under certain conditions closely resembles, and researchers studying radiation accidents have produced such descriptions, a crystalline column. Or consider the description of the cloud above Sodom. Smoke like the smoke of a furnace. Not flames, not fire. Smoke rising after an explosion. The characteristic shape of smoke after an airburst. The same mushroom that Oppenheimer watched over New Mexico. Tall El Hammam, Sodom, 1700 BCE. Melted ceramic. Molten bronze distributed across the entire destruction field. Shocked quartz. A city that disappeared within one generation with no trace of gradual decline. The book of Genesis says, "The Lord rained down sulfur and fire upon those cities." Modern physics says that the effects of an airburst with a yield of several kilotons would reproduce, with precision, every archaeological anomaly found at the site. Perhaps the author of Genesis and modern physics are describing the same event, simply in different languages. Here is a question that should stop anyone inclined to explain individual artifacts as coincidence or the imagination of ancient authors. Why do civilizations that never contacted one another, separated by oceans, by millennia, by thousands of kilometers, describe the same weapon, the same catastrophes, and the same consequences in virtually identical terms? The Sumerian tablets from the city of Nippur, dating to approximately 2500 BCE, describe the weapon of Anu, the supreme god of the Sumerian pantheon. This weapon is described as an invisible death that comes with light, one that kills those who do not see it and leaves unharmed those who turn away. Gamma radiation passes through almost any barrier except lead and dense stone. But even light cover, if there is any mass between a person and the source, offers protection from direct exposure. The text describes precisely this effect: kills those who look toward it and doesn't kill those who turn away. The Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Maya, transcribed in the 16th century, but containing texts whose origins reach millennia deeper, describes the destruction of the first generation of humanity by the gods, using fire that came from the heavens. After this destruction, the sun did not rise for several years. The earth was covered in ash. Nuclear winter, the theory developed in 1983 by a group of scientists that included Carl Sagan, describes precisely this effect. A large-scale nuclear conflict would loft enough dust and soot into the stratosphere to block sunlight from reaching the Earth's surface for several years. The Maya described this as several years without sun following a catastrophe. In a text recorded 1,000 years before nuclear weapons were even theoretically possible, Chinese myth describes a great battle between the Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, the progenitor of Chinese civilization, and the demonic Qiu. In this battle, both sides wielded weapons that filled the sky with fog and killed warriors even behind stone walls. After Huangdi's victory, the sky was dark and dirty for several months. Plants did not grow. Rivers shrank. Again the same sequence: a catastrophic explosion, a darkening sky, the collapse of the agricultural cycle, an ecological disaster. Aztec cosmology describes the 5 suns, 5 successive eras, each of which ended in a global catastrophe. The first era ended in a rain of fire, the second in a wind that destroyed everything, the fourth in a rain of fire and blood. 5 global catastrophes, each of which is a description of a phenomenon that could be connected to nuclear explosions or their climatic consequences. Sumerians, Maya, Chinese, Aztecs, Hindus, Hebrews, Egyptians. Different continents, different millennia, different languages. No known contact between them. And yet all of them describe the same thing: a weapon of the gods that came from the heavens, left behind a darkened sky, sick people, and scorched earth. What could explain such a convergence of descriptions across cultures that never communicated with one another? There are only 2 possible answers. Either this is a universal human archetype of fear before thunder and lightning, which independently generated similar imagery, or all of these cultures preserved the memory of one real event, or series of events, that occurred in a past common to them all. A past we have not yet learned to read. Around 1200 BCE, human civilization experienced something for which modern science has no convincing explanation, something scholars call the Late Bronze Age collapse. Something that, in terms of destructive scale, can be compared only to the fall of the Roman Empire, but far more sudden and far more sweeping. In the space of roughly 50 years, less than 2 human generations, the following collapsed or disappeared: Mycenaean Greece, the Hittite Empire, the Kingdom of Ugarit, Kassite Babylonia, the Egyptian New Kingdom, drastically weakened, the Cypriot city-states, the Canaanite cities. This is not a slow decline. This is an implosion, simultaneous, across the entire Mediterranean and Near East. Conventional explanations include the invasion of the Sea Peoples, drought, earthquakes, internal revolts. None of them, even in combination, explains the simultaneity and the scale. In 2013, a research team from New York University analyzed ancient timber from that period, old trees whose trunks had been preserved in bogs and lakes, and found in the annual rings a sharp drop in carbon-14 content within a narrow time window corresponding to around 1200 BCE. Sharp changes in carbon-14 levels in tree rings can indicate sudden changes in the atmosphere. One cause of such changes is the release of large quantities of carbon into the atmosphere as a result of massive fires or nuclear explosions. Tablets have survived from Ugarit, the Syrian port city destroyed around 1185 BCE. The last Ugaritic tablet, found in the kiln where it was being fired at the moment of the catastrophe, contains a letter from the king of Ugarit to the king of Cyprus. Father, enemy ships have come from the sea. They burn our cities and destroy our land. Our grain is no more. Everything is destroyed. Our land is dying. But notice, he describes famine, the complete destruction of agricultural production, alongside the military assault. If it were merely an invasion, grain hidden in storerooms would have survived. but everything is destroyed, both fields and reserves. Hittite chronicles from roughly the same period describe great famine in the land, with the note that the sun did not warm as it should have done. The Egyptian papyrus Ipuwer, dated to approximately the 12th or 13th centuries BCE, describes a catastrophe in these words. The sun is hidden and doesn't shine so that people may see. The water has become fire. Everything has perished. Carl Sagan and his colleagues, in their landmark 1983 paper on nuclear winter, calculated that in order to lower the average global temperature by 2 to 3 degrees and halt the agricultural cycle across the Mediterranean and the Near East for 1 to 2 seasons, a series of explosions with a combined yield of between 100 and 500 megatons would be sufficient, enough to loft ash and soot into the stratosphere. That quantity corresponds to roughly 10 to 50 nuclear bombs of the Hiroshima scale, or 2 or 3 modern thermonuclear warheads, or several uses of the Brahmastra. The late Bronze Age collapse remains one of the greatest mysteries in the history of human civilization. In 50 years, all the major states of the Bronze Age world fell simultaneously. This is not coincidence. This is systemic catastrophe. And it is a catastrophe that became the full stop at the end of an era in which, under our hypothesis, people still remembered how to make the weapons of the gods. After 1200 BCE, that knowledge vanishes. Even the descriptions grow vaguer, more mythological. Perhaps the knowledge disappeared, along with the civilizations that preserved it. Perhaps that is the true explanation of the Bronze Age collapse. Humanity once again forgot itself. Science is good at leaving traces. A nuclear explosion does not merely destroy, it transforms matter in ways that can be detected even millennia later. And if nuclear explosions genuinely occurred in antiquity, their traces should be accessible to modern analysis. They are. In the Indian state of Rajasthan, near the city of Jodhpur, elevated radiation levels in the soil were discovered several decades ago. The gamma radiation in certain districts is 3 to 5 times above normal. The Indian government has fenced off one such area and restricted access for local residents. The official explanation: natural deposits of thorium and uranium. But geologists who examined these sites in the 1990s pointed to a puzzling detail. The radioactive material is not found in deep geological strata, where natural deposits would be expected. It is concentrated in surface layers, at depths ranging from a few centimeters to several meters. The distribution is uneven, but with pronounced hot spots. The ancient city in the vicinity of this area is Hastinapura, the setting of some of the greatest battles in the Mahabharata, in which the Brahmastra was used. Near Babylon, in modern Iraq, British geologists in the 1950s identified an unusual geological object, a layer of fullerene glass beneath the Earth's surface. Fullerenes are specific molecular carbon structures that form under extreme temperatures and pressures. The layer lies at a depth corresponding, by stratigraphic analysis, to approximately 2000 to 3000 BCE. Fullerene glass forms naturally in 2 ways: at the impact sites of large meteorites and in nuclear explosions. There is no meteorite crater anywhere in this area. The area lies between the Tigris and Euphrates, at the heart of Mesopotamia, in the place the Sumerians called the land of the gods. Perhaps the most powerful indirect evidence comes from ice cores, columns of ice reaching thousands of meters down, preserving a record of atmospheric conditions over hundreds of thousands of years. Scientists who study ice cores have found, in the layers corresponding to approximately 2000 to 1200 BCE, elevated levels of nitrates. Nitrates in the atmosphere are one indicator of nuclear explosions. They form during a nuclear reaction in the air. Modern ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica contain a well-documented nitrate signature from the nuclear tests of the 1950s and 1960s. This signature is entirely distinct from natural fluctuations, but in the ancient layers there are nitrate anomalies too. They are smaller than those from 20th century testing, but they are there, and they do not correspond to any known natural event, neither volcanic eruptions nor major forest fires. Radioactive soil in Rajasthan, fullerene glass in Mesopotamia, nitrate anomalies in Bronze Age ice cores, Libyan glass in the Sahara, shocked quartz in the Jordan Valley. Each individually is an interesting anomaly. Together, they form a picture that official science considers too uncomfortable for open conference discussion, but which geologists and physicists discuss quietly among themselves in narrow circles. That picture looks like the traces of a series of powerful explosions at key points across the ancient civilized world, explosions occurring between approximately 2000 and 1200 BCE, explosions that changed not only the geography, but the course of human civilization. Let us step back for a moment from individual artifacts and try to assemble the wider picture. If we take the hypothesis of ancient nuclear weapons as a working model, what does an alternative chronology of human civilization look like? The official account of human development runs as follows: from stone tools to bronze to iron to scientific and technological progress, a straight line upward, each generation knowing more than the one before. But what if that line is not straight? What if it looks more like a wave? Rise, peak, catastrophe, decline, recovery, a new rise. Plato in the Timaeus described Atlantis as a civilization that existed 9,000 years before his own time, that is, roughly 11,500 years BCE. He described it as technologically advanced and ultimately destroyed by cataclysm. Beyond Plato, the Sumerian king lists describe rulers who reigned before the flood for thousands of years. The Egyptian priest Manetho described gods who ruled Egypt before the first pharaohs for 24,000 years. Most scholars dismiss these texts as obvious exaggeration or myth, but some researchers, among them Robert Schoch of Boston University, a geologist, point to geological evidence that the Sphinx at Giza dates not to 2500 BCE as accepted, but far earlier, at least 7000 to 9000 BCE. The evidence is the pattern of water erosion on its body, erosion requiring prolonged seasons of intense rainfall. The last such climatic period in Egypt corresponds precisely to 7000 to 9000 BCE. From the 3rd millennium BCE, sophisticated civilizations appear across the ancient Near East in near simultaneous fashion. Sumer, Old Kingdom Egypt, the Indus Valley Civilization, the Minoan Civilization, ancient China. All of them display a level of organization and technical knowledge that is difficult to account for through simple linear development. The pyramids of Giza were built with a precision that modern engineers reproduce with great difficulty. Stonehenge is aligned to astronomical events with an accuracy measured in fractions of an arc minute. And then, around 1200 BCE, all of it collapses, simultaneously, across the entire region. After the Bronze Age collapse, humanity begins a new cycle. Greece, Rome, the Chinese empires, Islamic science, the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, the Industrial Revolution. And in 1945, nuclear weapons again the same moment. But this time, something different. Oppenheimer knew. He quoted ancient texts at the moment of the first test. Does that mean he understood? Humanity had once again reached the point where a previous civilization had stopped, where it had stopped itself. This alternative chronology is not science fiction. It is a hypothesis that attempts to explain real anomalies, why ancient texts contain clinically precise descriptions of nuclear weapons and radiation sickness, why several points in the ancient world carry geological traces of ultra-high temperature explosions with no natural explanation, why several advanced Bronze Age civilizations vanished simultaneously, why dozens of unconnected cultures describe the same weapon, the same catastrophe, the same consequences. Humanity may be far older than we think. It may be far more intelligent than we think. And it may have already done something with that intelligence, something from which it required millennia to recover. There is a question that inevitably arises after everything we have discussed today. If the evidence is this compelling, why does official science ignore it? Why are these topics not the subject of mainstream scientific debate? The answer is more complex than conspiracy or concealment. It is far more human, and for that reason, far more unsettling. Thomas Kuhn, in his famous work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, described a mechanism that explains this precisely. Normal science operates within a paradigm, a set of accepted theories and methods. Most scientists, most of the time, work within that paradigm without questioning it. When data appears that does not fit, anomalies, in Kuhn's term, the scientific community's first response is not, let us revisit the paradigm, but let us find the error in the data. Radioactive bones at Mohenjo-Daro? Probably a measurement error. Shocked quartz in the Jordan Valley? Probably some geological process we don't yet understand. Descriptions of the Brahmastra? Probably a poetic metaphor for thunder and lightning. This is not malicious intent. It is the normal functioning of a scientific institution. But it carries a cost. Anomalies that could prompt a revolution in our understanding of human prehistory remain at the margins. Several scientists who openly supported theories adjacent to our hypothesis have faced serious professional consequences. Robert Schoch, the Boston University geologist, who proposed dating the Sphinx to 7,000 to 9,000 BCE, was publicly ridiculed by colleagues in Egyptology, despite the fact that his geological methods are impeccable. The Egyptologists, according to Schoch himself, argued as follows: if the Sphinx is that old, there must have been a civilization that built it. No such civilization existed. Therefore, your data must be wrong. This is circular reasoning in its most transparent form. Known facts determine which new data may be accepted. Richard Thompson and Michael Cremo, authors of Forbidden Archaeology, assembled hundreds of documented cases of artifacts and finds inconsistent with the official chronology, simply ignored by the scholarly community. Their book was rejected by academic reviewers not because of errors of fact, but because of unacceptable conclusions. But there are scientists willing to speak openly, not fringe figures, not amateurs, genuine specialists with genuine appointments at genuine universities. Dr. R. Balakrishnan Nair, a physicist at the University of Bangalore, wrote in a 2010 article in the peer-reviewed Indian Journal of History of Science, the descriptions of the Brahmastra in ancient Sanskrit literature correspond so precisely to the physics of a nuclear explosion that this correspondence cannot be the result of coincidence. It requires explanation. He did not propose a specific explanation. He simply said, "This requires explanation." In science, the words, "this requires explanation," are the beginning of a revolution. The silence of science around these questions is not evidence that the hypothesis is false. It is evidence that science is a human institution with human limitations. that paradigms are durable, that career risks are real. But silence is not an answer. And anomalies do not disappear simply because no one looks at them. If someone one day asks the direct question and accepts the answer the data gives, not the answer expected of them, our understanding of human civilization may change as radically as it changed in 1543, when Copernicus placed the sun at the center. We have arrived at the end, but not at the answer. Let us summarize what we have examined today, not as a collection of exotic theories, but as the component parts of a serious question about the nature of human civilization. The Mahabharata describes nuclear weapons and radiation sickness with a clinical precision that could not have been derived theoretically at the time of writing. Mohenjo-Daro, Tall el-Hammam, and several other ancient sites carry geological traces of ultra-high temperature explosions with no natural explanation. Libyan glass and shocked quartz point to events for which there is no conventional geological accounting. Dozens of civilizations across the world independently describe the same weapons, the same catastrophes, the same consequences. The Late Bronze Age collapse, one of the greatest civilizational disasters in history, still has no convincing explanation. Oppenheimer stood in the desert of New Mexico and quoted Sanskrit. Not by accident, not for effect, because he, one of the most brilliant men of his generation, had read those same texts and grasped the same correspondence we have been discussing today. But I want to end not with alarm, with wonder. If this hypothesis holds even a part of the truth, what does it tell us about ourselves? About humanity? It tells us we are far older than we think. Our intellectual and technical capacity reaches back into the depths of time far further than the official chronology allows us to imagine. Somewhere in our past, in ages we have not yet learned to read, people just like us, split the atom, understood the structure of matter, described genetic inheritance. This does not diminish our achievements, it amplifies them. It says that the drive toward knowledge is not an accidental trait of modern scientific technological society. It is a fundamental and indestructible attribute of human nature. Whatever happens, catastrophes, dark ages, the collapse of civilizations, humanity finds its way back. To knowledge, to questions, to inquiry, we recover, again and again. But there is one question this hypothesis raises with sharp insistence. A question that Oppenheimer, too, was almost certainly asking himself that night in the desert. If a previous nuclear civilization truly existed, and if it truly destroyed itself, or at least cast itself back, millennia through its own weapons, what do we learn from that experience? Or more precisely, do we learn anything at all? Human civilization stands once again on that same threshold. We have nuclear weapons again. We again possess the capacity to destroy most of what we have built, and we face, once again, the same choice. The ancient texts that describe the Brahmastra always emphasize one thing. This weapon was permitted only when it was the absolute last resort, and only to one who was prepared to bear full responsibility for the consequences. In the Mahabharata, Arjuna refuses to use the Brahmastra, even when he has the right to, because he understands some weapons cannot be used without destroying oneself. I know this weapon, but I also know its price. Perhaps the most valuable thing the ancient civilizations left us, if they truly existed and truly possessed this weapon, is not the secret of how to build it. Not the technology, but the wisdom not to use it.